you can look at different things. You can talk about ethnic issues. You can talk about Iranian nationalism. You can talk about all types of things. The moment of euphoria, that which sent people out into the street to bare their chests, is that which sends Palestinians out to blow themselves to bits and kill as many Jews along with them as they can. It's theology and ideology and whatever else may be happening there. That's the game changer, and that's the main variable in the equation that we should be investigating.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's 3 o'clock on the east coast of the United States, 8 o'clock in London, and 10 o'clock in Jerusalem. Let's get started. My name's Jonathan Silver. I'm the editor of Mosaic, and we are convened to discuss Professor Ze'ev Maghen's essay, How Iran Thinks, published on March 7th in Mosaic. We'll be joined a bit later on by the analyst Michael Doran. More about each of them in due course. I want to begin with reference to an essay that the late Charles Krauthammer wrote for Time magazine nearly 40 years ago. The short essay is called The Mirror Image Fallacy, and it begins with an innocuous but illustrative example. For in yet another piece of writing published at the time in The New Yorker, a writer visited the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, and looking upon the grave and weary president, concluded that Lincoln would have liked to live out a long life, surrounded by old friends and good food. Good food? Krauthammer asks. New Yorker readers have an interest in souffles, but it's hard to recall the most melancholy and spiritual of presidents giving them much thought. New Yorker editors, no doubt, dream of living out their days grazing at gourmet pastures. But did Lincoln really long to return to a table at Lutece? This habit of mind, Krauthammer diagnoses as a variety of solipsism. And while this particular example is innocuous, the habit of mind that it illustrates is not. The fundamental assumption that everybody wants what you want, that everybody honors what you honor, that everybody finds disgraceful what you find disgraceful. This mirror image fallacy, when exercised in other arenas of thought and action, is dangerous. Say, for example, when American policymakers look upon our adversaries and claim to see beneath their accents and their wardrobe and their quirky music women and men with the same fundamental sensibilities and hierarchies of value that obtain in New York or Washington. That's not enlightened cosmopolitanism, but a narrowed and diminished inability to see beyond the mirrored glass. Now, it may be true that Israelis and Palestinians both want peace in some very abstracted way, but that simply doesn't tell us very much. For Israel's enemies want peace only after the Jewish state is wiped away from the face of the earth. I'm thinking of President Obama's speech to the people of Israel. He delivered it in Jerusalem in March 2013. He said that he had met with some Palestinians and explained to this Israeli audience, they weren't that different from my daughters. They weren't that different from your daughters or sons, he told them. I honestly believe, he said, that if any Israeli parent sat down with those kids, they'd say, I want these kids to succeed. I want them to prosper. I want them to have opportunities just like my kids do. I believe that's what Israeli parents want for these kids if they had a chance to listen to them and talk to them. Now, to this, I respond to President Obama, you might be right. I'm sure that Israeli and Palestinian parents both want opportunities for their children, just like American and Indian and Brazilian parents do. But my point is not to deny these basic commonalities, but instead to assert that these basic commonalities are not at issue when terrorists gun down civilians in Bnei Brak, or when a Saudi oil field is targeted by a drone attack, or when an American consulate is fired upon in Iraq, or when the Ayatollah Khomeini threatens to detonate a nuclear warhead in Tel Aviv. Now, I say all this by way of introduction because understanding how our adversaries think, how they really think, requires us to see through the mirror image fallacy. And in reading 4 recent histories of Iran, all by eminent historians and wise analysts, each one of whom really do adduce serious evidence for their explanations of why and how the Iranian Revolution unfurled as it did, Ze'ev Maghen, nevertheless, came to judge that the conventional wisdom that's now coalescing about what makes Iran tick is still fundamentally shaped by the mirrored prejudices of the analysts, who cannot quite see beyond themselves into the nation that they want to explain. Now, I'll let him situate and elaborate on this claim in just a moment. Ze'ev Maghen, of course, is chair of the Department of Middle Eastern Studies at Bar-Ilan University, and he's at work on a book that explores the worldview of Iran's leadership class. Ze'ev will recapitulate the themes from his essay for 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'll bring in today's examiner, Michael Doran, senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and director of its new Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East. Then at about 3:45 or so, we'll have a few minutes for your questions, which I will invite you to ask by typing them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. One last thing before we begin. Obviously, we all have in mind that at any moment, news could come forth from Vienna that Russia has succeeded in brokering a new deal with Iran. That's obviously on all of our minds, and it's lurking in the background of this discussion, but the purpose of today's conversation is not to probe the hypothetical details of a deal that has not yet been announced. When it is, you can be sure that we at Mosaic will help our readers understand it and analyze its implications. But today we ask a more fundamental question about the regime. Ze'ev, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, John. Good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be here. One of the cornucopia of things that keep me up at night, on top of the fact that it is officially open season on Jews in the Jewish state, an issue which I'll get back to momentarily because it is germane, is the pervasive, almost universal outlook among Iran watchers, Middle East analysts, and educated lay people, according to which Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, is essentially a little Vladimir Putin, a Putin writ small. Now, this, to my mind, is a horrific mistake. Khamenei is far more dangerous to the West and to the world at large than Putin will ever be. And let me try to explain why in a way that is guaranteed to annoy the living hell out of most policy wonks and realpolitik-oriented observers by taking the long view and delving, albeit briefly, into the disdained and discarded disciplines of history and ideology. Ladies and gentlemen, ideas matter. Hegel said, once the world of ideas has been transformed, reality cannot hold out for long. John Stuart Mill echoed, ideas are the thing on earth which most influences human behavior and, in the long run, overbears every other influence. This, Mill went on to emphasize, is the lesson given to mankind by every age and generation, and yet always and inevitably disregarded. And Virgil put the matter in simple but ringing terms. Mens agitat molem. Spirit moves matter. Ideas move people. Now, as Mill noted, human history simply never ceases demonstrating the veracity of this proposition, and our analysts, pundits, and social science-oriented academics never cease ignoring it. The Romans conquered Greece, but Greek religion and philosophy conquered Rome. Those same Romans conquered Palestine, but a local hippie Jew boy traipsing around the Galilee delivering sermons to whomever would listen took over the entire Roman Empire. The barbarians conquered Rome, but Roman ideas and institutions took the barbarians by storm, producing what we refer to as Western civilization. From the 10th through the 16th century, Turkish warrior hordes came crashing through the Middle East, burning, pillaging, and slaughtering as they went, and each and every one of them was promptly overcome by the faith and lifestyle of their butchered victims, Islam. And of course, no example in history beats that of the Jews. We are the proof in the pudding of Virgil's mens agitat molem. The pen will ever and anon best the sword. Ideas will always prevail against brute force in the long run, even in Eastern Europe today. And Khomeinism is a very powerful idea. It is, in a nutshell, the age-old dream of the Shiite branch of Islam, indeed, the very raison d'etre of the Shiite branch of Islam, to reunite sacerdotum et imperium, religion and state, after they were torn asunder upon the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Khomeinism also represents, unlike, for instance, the doctrines of ISIS or the various Salafi jihadi organizations, the attempt to balance tradition and modernity, which makes it, in some ways, far more compelling than Western progressivism, which has chucked tradition into the wastebasket and hurtles pell-mell into a whacked-out modernity that knows no bounds. But Western academics and analysts have little patience for the power of ideas and little knowledge of the vast and complex labyrinth that is religious thought. And so they strive in 100 different ways to reduce the underlying motivations informing the policies of the Islamic Republican regime to power, period. In other words, they attempt to parse Khamenei the way they parse Putin, and they tend to deploy in such cases the weapon of the wink. We all know, wink, wink, that behind and beneath all that religious and ideological rhetoric, it's really all about naked power and money, wink, wink. And if you insist otherwise, they smile that knowing, cynical smile of the hard-bitten realist and dismiss the fluffy notion of a government of religion, by religion, and for religion as silly naivete. Now, this pervasive outlook leads present-day scholarship on Iran to some rather silly conclusions itself. Upon one of these, I remarked in the review piece, the revisionist rehabilitation of the last Pahlavi Shah, Muhammad Reza, as a friend of religion, even as a devout Muslim, a portrait drawn by Cooper and Milani, two brilliant researchers who got this one wildly wrong. But the corollary of this refrocking of the Shah is the defrocking of Ayatollah Khomeini and his successor, Ayatollah Khamenei. Now, this has become a regular pastime of Middle East specialists and Iranologists. Here is the great Ervand Avrahamian, I do not say that sarcastically, spending dozens of pages trying desperately to show how Khomeinism was really just socialism wrapped up in religious garb. And here is a young but astute scholar named Muhammad Ayatollahi Tabar, following in the footsteps of the older, more experienced Asghar Shirazi, performing all types of intellectual chicanery in order to demonstrate that the Islamic Republican leaders are not guided in the least by religion, but are rather driftwood tossed about by the ebb and flow of public opinion. Dozens of authors enumerate the countless areas in which, so they claim, the Ayatollahs in charge of Iran fall short in carrying out or enforcing Islamic ordinances or compromise their religious principles for pragmatic purposes. Meanwhile, anyone who knows anything at all about Islam can tell you that doing exactly that, making exactly that compromise, is the central principle governing Shiite Sharia jurisprudence. And I have to admit that I always find such arguments to be a laugh riot. Here are these thoroughly Westernized and secularized ex-Iranian academics who, for the most part, haven't entered a mosque, fasted during Ramadan, beat themselves in memory of the Imam Hussein, or cracked open a Shiite Muslim text since they were born, to say nothing of their American and European counterparts who weren't Muslims at all. And they've got the unmitigated gall to tell a bunch of ayatollahs who have spent an average of 50 years in the seminaries of Rome and Najaf, plunging into Muslim scriptural, traditional, legal, and literary sacred canons, how to properly practice Islam. That's like, I don't know, Ellen DeGeneres taking the Pope to task for not conducting a proper mass. And of course, what makes this doubly humorous is that whenever, for the purposes of our anti-Iranian propaganda campaigns, which I'm all for, don't get me wrong, whenever we need Iran to be run by a bunch of messianic, medieval, religious, fundamentalist, blah, 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 whose policies are thoroughly metaphysical and violently irrational, and so they can't be allowed to get their hands on a nuclear weapon, God forbid, all of a sudden, presto changeo, that's what they are. Frum as can be, right? All of a sudden, they got religion. But when we want to show them up as cynical, power-hungry hypocrites who are only guided by realpolitik and hedonistic self-interest, and who failed to realize their dream of establishing a truly Islamic republic, and we gloat about this, all of a sudden, that's what they are. And this is all part and parcel of our overall approach to appraising Iran, an approach that I cannot characterize other than one of pure fantasy, pretty much from top to bottom, including the axiom, which is bandied about virtually unopposed no matter where you go, from academic to journalistic to intelligence circles, to the effect that all Iranians hate the mullahs and just aspire to be secular Americans. In other words, not only do we in the fiercely secular West refuse to believe that Iran's leaders could be truly religious, we refuse to believe that Iran's people could be truly religious as well. And there is nothing we delight in more than discovering and exploiting the most recent underground video of scantily clad North Teheranians shaking their booties to the beat of rap music in somebody's basement. Now, never mind the fact that at that very moment, not only are 10 times that number of their compatriots busy praying in the mosque next door. Now, we don't find prayer service videos as captivating as naked Persian tuchuses, so those videos don't go viral. But even the party goers themselves will, for the most part, be found at the mosque the next day, beating their breasts for the Imam Hussein, because that's the mysterious and complex way in which Shiite Islam works. But most of those who pronounce upon Iranian state and society today don't know the first thing about Shiite Islam, just as a large number of them don't know Persian, let alone Arabic, the latter language being essential for delving into the classical literature, which molds the mindsets of Iran's leaders and citizens today more than ever. And so, because it is easier for us to conceive and more convenient as well, we portray Iran as a little Russia and Khamenei as a little Putin. And while we're at it, the same voices here in Israel portray the Palestinian Muslim gunmen, stabbers, and suicide bombers that murder Jews in the streets week after week as motivated by anything other than what they say they are motivated by, i.e. by Islam, and argue ad nauseum that were we just to invest more millions in the economic infrastructure of the Arab towns and cities, all would be well. Meanwhile, a doctoral student of mine wrote a thesis many years back in which he showed conclusively that some 75% of the Arab attackers came from middle or upper class backgrounds. And believe this or not, the parents of my Muslim female students at the university regularly call and plead with me to convince their daughters not to go all the way and add the gloves and the full facial mask to the already universal hijab covering. And for the most part, I fail and have quite the time of taking a roll afterwards. To conclude, it's time finally to take religion seriously, especially what is soon to become the world's largest religion quantitatively, and is already the world's largest religion qualitatively, i.e., with the highest number of genuinely devout followers. So in short, you want to understand Iran, you got to know Islam.
Mike, if you want to understand Iran, you have to know Islam.
Well, thank you, John. Thanks, Ze'ev, and thanks to everybody out there. I'm assuming there are people on the other end of this. I can only see the three of us, but thanks to the thousands of you who are out there. And Ze'ev, thank you for this really engaging essay, putting a really important question, I think, front and center. I think I'll just start by putting my cards on the table. I think I'm among those who think that Khamenei is a little Putin. And we can explore that as time goes on. But before I explain myself in that regard, let me just say that I think your central argument that Islam is, you have to understand something about Islam to understand Iran, especially the Islamic Republic and Iran's leaders. And even more important, there is an ideology, certainly in academia, absolutely in academia, but I think even wider than academia, it's in American elite culture that is opposed to seeing religion as a central part of the worldview of the leaders of Iran. There are many different elements to that ideology. It is a kind of just general secular American, I think, mistake. I think it's something that Americans do time and time again, and maybe the West does, where they engage in mirror imaging and project their own concerns to foreign leaders who are really coming from a completely different cultural and historical background. I think that's true, by the way, of our understanding of Russian leaders as well as Iranian leaders. So I got to start by stipulating that, granting you complete, I think, success in making that case. Furthermore, there's a passage in your article. I don't have the article right here in front of me. There's a passage in your article where you discuss the attitude of some of our diplomats who believe that there's a deal to be had with the Iranians, who cannot bring themselves to think that Iran has aspirations to destroy the United States. They look at the balance of power, and they can't believe that a power as weak, relatively speaking, as Iran could possibly have the aspiration to take over the whole Middle East, destroy Israel, undermine the American order, and so on, and actually laugh at those of us, because I agree with you on that 100%, and they laugh at us when we say that they actually do have such aspirations. They say it all the time, and we should understand where that's coming from. Again, I totally agree with you. Where I start to disagree with you, there's a passage in your essay early on where you survey the multi-causal reasons for the Islamic Revolution, and you sort of dismiss that and you say, no, there has to be one cause, and there is this one cause, which is Islam. And it's at that point where I think where you become reductive, when you're dismissing these other things, because just because Islam is important, and just because we need to know about Islam in order to understand the mindset of the leaders, doesn't mean all of these other things aren't going on. Economics, class conflict, ethnic conflict, which I think is a growing issue in Iran, and at one point in your presentation just now, there was a phrase you used, complex and mysterious. You were referring to Shiite Islam. I find Iran to be the most complex and mysterious country in the Middle East, and not simply because of Shiite Islam. I first got really deeply interested in Iran when I was working in the White House. I had Iran in my portfolio. I spent more time reading top secret intelligence on Iran than on any other country, and trying to come to grips with what the worldview of Khamenei was. And I developed a line, which I said kind of as a joke, but it was actually really serious, that on all the major questions with regard to Iran, I have two answers, or I have one of two answers. And they are, I don't know, and it depends. There's not another country in the Middle East, I think, which is so defined by its contradictions. And the Iranians revel in this themselves. It's remarkable. And so I guess when I have this discussion with you, I come at it from the point of view of radical skepticism. And so your certainty about the importance of this one issue, I think, gives me pause. And the way you have defined it, you've given yourself a kind of escape clause here, because you said, well, pragmatism and accommodation with issues other than orthodoxy is part of the orthodoxy. So you've already set it up so that you have a thesis that cannot possibly be refuted. So I give you high marks for creating the irrefutable thesis. But I intend, as we go along here, to throw out some accommodations with non-orthodoxy that the leaders engage in all the time, that I hope will challenge you a little bit, even as I know you'll hold on to that thesis.
Ze'ev, you want to respond to this first point from Mike?
Well, first of all, Mike, you got me. You really, you called me red-handed. If I didn't actually believe in that statement, it would sound like just a way to make it impossible for anyone to attack my position. But I think that just to take the last point you made, and try to explain myself very briefly, I think that the way that many scholars, if not most scholars, take advantage of what they see as lapses in, pure Islamic policymaking in order to upend the idea that we have to do with Orthodox practitioners and theologians in charge of the Iranian state. I think it indicates that they have not really exposed themselves to this fascinating phenomenon, this fascinating contradiction. Religion is not this black and white phenomenon. Orthodoxy, and I'm not even talking about Shiite Islamic Orthodoxy. It could be talking about Jewish Orthodoxy or Christian Orthodoxy. They're not black and white phenomena. The notion of blind faith, the notion that we have to toe a line, the notion that we don't need to accommodate reality because God will take care of us, even if we, don't, we can just rely on God. Everybody knows the famous story about the guy who relied on God when the flood came, and he went up to the top of his house, and when he was drowned, he said to God, "But I relied on you." And God said, "Well, I sent you all these boats and you didn't take any of them." I mean, one of the things you discover about Orthodoxy when you're part of it is that it is extremely pragmatic in a great many areas. And it's not about removal from the world. It's not about a metaphysical outlook. It's not about some kind of world renunciation. It's not about being irrational. It's about, in many ways, being extremely rational. Look at the Talmud. The Talmud is, in so many ways, not only the height of rationality, but the fount of Jewish genius. And it is an Orthodox Jewish text, if not the Orthodox Jewish text. And it's full of accommodations to practical situations. So I think it's really important to kind of, I'd like to put to bed this whole attempt to show up the Iranians as religious hypocrites, as not true Shiite Muslims, not believers or something like that. I'd like to put it to bed. They spent 50 years in the seminary. And I think the more important point here is that I certainly accept your first criticism, which is that, yes, the revolution was a complex phenomenon, and we can talk about how complex it was and how many factors went into it for a lot of time, if we're academics and we have that time. But instead, we're trying to fathom the adversary that we're dealing with and what brought it into being. And if we want to do that, we should focus on the real power moment, the crescendo and the supernova, and that which distinguished Iran from all of the countries around it in the Middle East and the world, and led to this incredible event, what might possibly be seen as the first popular revolution in the history of humankind. And with all of the other stuff, yes, there's some kind of argument that God knows how anyone could possibly support it, that Iranians were economically upset in the 70s. That to me is just not only it's 2020 blindsight. It's not 2020 hindsight. But you can look at different things. You can talk about ethnic issues. You can talk about Iranian nationalism. You can talk about all types of things. The moment of euphoria, that which sent people out into the street to bare their chests, is that which sends Palestinians out to blow themselves to bits and kill as many Jews along with them as they can. It's theology and ideology and whatever else may be happening there. That's the game changer, and that's the main variable in the equation that we should be investigating.
Okay, let me hone in there then on that issue. I think if we could, I'd like to look at two parts of it. The first part is the revolution, but in your essay, you move from discussion of the revolution to talking about Iran today, and you also move from arguments about historical causality to arguments about policy making, which is the issue that I'm most personally I'm most interested in. So let's start with the revolution, and then let's go to the policy making side. Here are some of the contradictions I see with regard to the revolution. I think anyone who's looked at the revolution recognizes that all of those students that the Shah sent to Western universities who were carrying out in the United States, carrying out demonstrations day after day after day against the Shah, played some role in the delegitimation of the Shah's regime. If not at home, certainly abroad, but I think probably at home and abroad. I have an Iranian friend who participated in those demonstrations in the United States and in Iran. And she tells me that she went out completely covered, protesting against the Shah. She's not religious. She wasn't religious then. It made perfect sense to her when she was doing it, but she looks back at it now kind of like the way I look back at attitudes I had when I was 15, 16 years old. And I think, what the hell was I thinking? Why did that make sense to me at the time? And I think our understanding of the revolution, therefore, has to take into account, I'm not saying that those people are the essence of, they're necessarily the engine of the revolution. I'm not sure there was a single, as I said, a single cause of the revolution, but they're part of that moment. They're part of that moment. And I don't think it really is right, correct, accurate to say what they were actually out there, what was driving them was Islam. And that we also know there were lots of different strains in Islamic politics at the time. In the end, Khamenei, being a more clever politician, was able to take it to its most radical, form. But the people out there protesting, who did a lot to bring down the regime, were not there to put Khomeini's form of Islam in power. That was never their goal.
Well, I just want to say one thing about the overseas students, which was what the Shah sent all of these tens of thousands of students, and then as payment for that, he got heckled at every time he went to visit the States. You're 100% correct. But it actually made a great deal of sense, and you can tell your friend that I am trying to exonerate her. What she was doing, it's a lot of chutzpah for me to psychologize her from a distance and not knowing her. But what she and so many others were doing was rather paradoxical, but in the end made sense. The Europe essentially at that time was in the throes of a revolution of its own in the direction of authenticity, whether it was nationalist authenticity or ethnic authenticity. Everybody was in the 60s and 70s, got to be authentic. I remember it myself as a little kid. Got to be authentic, and it was all of a sudden cool. And the notion of of cultural imperialism began to be derided as the great enemy. And these people they weren't religious themselves, a great many of them. They put on their hijabs, their head coverings, these women, or they chanted these Islamic slogans because it was part of saying this westernization that has been carried out by the Pahlavi Shahs undermines our very identity. It is humiliating to us as a nation, as a civilization that has a hoary kind of honorable past. And this led over time, in many of them, into becoming Islamists of one form or another. And then there were those like your friend who became disappointed by it. It was like, look what it led to. Because many people don't realize that when you ask for authenticity, if you work hard enough, you get it, and then you may not be happy with it because you yourself were raised on Western ideas, right? And now all of a sudden you have to give them up. And that's no fun for lots of people. There's a lot of people who made the revolution afterwards said, geez, what have I done to myself? I can't have fun anymore. I agree with that. They did. But while they were doing it, there was a rationale behind it. And that rationale, you don't want to call it Islam, call it the desire for self-determination, cultural authenticity, and desire to come out from under the thumb of foreign cultural imperialism.
Great. Okay, I'll do that. But then I do think that we need to make a distinction between that and Islam. I don't think they're the same thing. I think at that particular moment in time, the clerics who were leading the revolution, led by Khomeini, were able to cast their net wide enough so the people who felt, let's call it cultural dislocation, inauthenticity, a desire to go back to a world that was more coherent and understandable and closer to their own traditions. He cast his net wide enough so that those people could be part of it, but that's not Islam. That's not Islam. And they don't necessarily have, like my friend that I mentioned, they don't necessarily have the kind of deep-seated hostility to the West, to the Western order that Khomeini had and that Khamenei has. And that already sets up quite a different dynamic than the one you suggest when you say that really we have to focus on Islam. And just
Islam does cast its net rather wide. It does include throughout history and even at the present time people who don't even pray. Lots and lots of people who don't fast during Ramadan consider themselves Muslims and, loyal Muslims. There were caliphs who got drunk every day. There is a latitude here, but I do agree with you that what happened in the end was that the revolution, I don't want to say it was hijacked, it really was led, even in its early stages, back in 1963 in the dress rehearsal for the revolution. And since that time, all the way through the 70s, it was led ultimately by clerics. The signs that everybody was holding up during the revolution were mostly of Khomeini, partially of Shariati, and to a much smaller extent of Mosaic, who was to a large extent a secularist. And in the end, it became a clerical regime. And it is to this day a clerical regime. And it is in fact a seminary writ large. They run the country like a seminary. And they have raised a generation of Iranians, many more of whom have accepted their outlook on the world than we would like to believe, in my humble opinion. And I'll just finish with one point, and that is, a couple of years ago, there was the protest by several young ladies across the country against the headscarf, and they doffed their headscarf and they held it up, right? And we all cheered for them, of course, which I think is kind of weird because we have, well, let's put that aside. And we all assumed that that's what all ladies in Iran want to do. My students following the social media in Iran at the time found a great deal more public hostility on the part of women in Iran to these ladies, many of whom had the police called on them by other women. Maybe they thought their hairdos were nicer than, I don't know, but the truth is what they said they were doing was protecting their children from women who were disrobing and corrupting the public morals. Because a woman with her hair uncovered in the Islamic world is considered to be, what do we call it when someone exposes themselves in English? I've already forgotten, but
immodest?
Well, no, I was talking about the guy, on a dark street who walks up to a kid and opens up his.
What do you call it?
I don't remember
either.
None of us can think of the word.
John, you know all about this, don't you? What is it called?
Let me see if I can pick up to bring this part of our conversation to a close before we get to questions from the audience. I don't want to neglect Mike's second area of interest, the policy making area of interest. And Mike, let me try to formulate from my point of view this dimension of the question. I'll let you refine it, and then Ze'ev, you can answer us. But if I were to try to inhabit the coarse, unsophisticated, numbskull realist that you're arguing against,
That's me.
I would say I would ask you this question. Let's say I agree with you, and you can't understand the regime if you don't understand its own theological commitments. What changes in my analysis of the region? Let's say I do agree, and you do have to understand its theological animating spirit. How does it change the way that how does that manifest in terms of policy and its actions in the region and its actions domestically too?
So do we let Ze'ev answer that, or do I?
Mike,
refine?
is that a fair way to inhabit the spirit that I'm trying to convey?
I wanted to, let's let Ze'ev answer that, and then let me come back, because I want to take it in a slightly different direction.
Okay, go ahead.
But it's a good question. So
It is a good question. I think that it changes only everything.
Okay.
The minute that we realize, and once again, I take it back to what's going on here in Israel. I have endured decades here of policy analysts and decision makers and intelligence people and academics who feel that if we essentially invested in the infrastructure of the Israeli Arab towns, for instance, that we could get them to continue being the good Israeli Arab. Don't want to use the term Uncle Tom, but something of that sort. And you would have heard for really year after year after year, even up until the present, the statement that Israeli Arabs, as opposed to the Palestinians in the territories, are the good Arabs, and they like Israel. They actually feel themselves to be Israelis, et cetera, et cetera. And this to me has led to the present day debacle that we are actually being, shot at in the streets by automatic fire in the midst of our cities by Israeli Arabs, time and time again, just in the past couple of weeks. Some people are beginning to wake up to the fact that you cannot buy these people. And you cannot buy the Iranians. You cannot you cannot come to an agreement with them that they will honor in the long run. You cannot, because they cannot. They simply cannot, based on their religious principles, which I believe, although they may compromise in the short run, Mike, they will never compromise in the long run. When Iran says, keeps mum about the Uyghur Muslims in China who are being, systematically dispossessed, and all types of nasty things are happening to them, and Iran stays mum about these Muslims. Number one, it's because they're Sunni Muslims, but let's put that aside. They do it because they have a long-term game plan, the ultimate motivation and aspiration of which is the hegemony of Islam over the Middle East and eventually over the rest of the world. And in order to get there, there are tactical moves that you have to engage in, such as shutting up when your number one partner, the Chinese, oppresses a small group of Muslims. Small. So I think that when we start to realize things like that these people cannot be bought, that these people will not honor the agreements that we make with them, as just one of many examples, and that these people cannot have their regime changed, neither by trying to foment ethnic discord, which has been one of our the policies of Western intelligence organizations for decades. It's never gotten anywhere, but we keep on pushing it, or broadcasting into Iran, paying millions of dollars to the Voice of America in Persian to broadcast into Iran on Ashura, the holiest, most solemn occasion on the Shiite Muslim calendar, videos of Florida spring break, as well as a documentary. This is just this past year, a documentary on the return of women's roller derby. This was done on the holiest day. It was broadcast with, jam avoidance technology into Iranian homes on the holiest day in the hopes that this is what they really want. They want to strip down. They want their daughters to strip down. They want to be just like the kids at Florida spring break. And if we show them enough of that, then they're going to undermine their regime and make a counter-revolution. Whereas what really happens is that because most of Iranian society is religious in the latitudinarian sense and Islamic, the dads take a look at this and they said, well, I wasn't too happy about the government or about the regime, but when you showed me this, and I realized that if I pull my finger out of the dike, that eventually my daughter is going to strip down and pour booze all over herself in front of a bunch of men, I'm sticking to Khomeinism. I think all of these are policies, we would change our policies from A to Z if we finally respected the power of Islam.
Mike, I want you to reply to that, but let me just say in parentheses that you can always count on Mosaic readers who are helpfully chiming in with the words that were eluding you prudes. But, with synonyms.
Exhibitionist.
Exhibitionist and flasher.
Exhibitionist.
Mike, please go on.
So, Ze'ev, I think you put your finger on something there when you were talking about the father pulling his finger out of the dike. And that is the inherent attraction of popular Western culture. One of the reasons why the regime can accept Chinese music and not Western music is because of the inherent attraction that it has. Globally, the American culture is, whether we like it or whether we like it or not, it is attractive. It is attractive to youth. American freedom is attractive. The Shah himself had this problem, as you discussed in your review essay. He wanted all of the technology and all of the instruments of power that came from the West, but he didn't want to open up. He sent all these students abroad, but when they came back and they said, we also want the political freedom that goes along with it, he had to put the brakes on there. This regime is having exactly the same problem. Now, they have created a set of institutions based on Islam that allow them to hold the line in that way. But we know that there has been a significant secularization in Iranian culture. Do I know do I know the percentages? No, but the anecdotal evidence is overwhelming. I mean, so there's so much anecdotal evidence that is beyond anecdotal evidence that a very large percentage of the Iranian public, including people who are attached to traditions and even Islamic traditions, don't buy the rhetoric of the regime. The regime they regard as at best a necessary evil that they have to deal with. It has the slogans of the regime, the actual slogans of the regime, the leadership. They don't regard the leadership as committed to their values. The slogans of the regime don't have any purchase over their hearts at all. And
Mike,
you mentioned
Mike,
one more thing. You
nobody-
mentioned the ethnic issue. There is rising ethnic politics going on as well. There's every class of people in Iran. Every class of people has registered. Every class of people and every major city has registered significant protest against this regime. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't mean that this regime is not durable. It may be durable, but there is a very significant legitimacy deficit that it has. And so just to
Mike,
finish,
there's a very significant legitimacy deficit.
Let me finish just to make the point. If our goal is to understand, we said from the, when John set this up at the beginning, he said, we want to understand the people sitting across the table from us. And your thesis is we've got to understand religion. We have to understand the classical tradition. That's in order to get into their minds. Equally important, I would say, possibly even more important, is we have to understand that they are sitting on top of a volcano and they know it. And part of the reason that they want to keep the Islamic Republic like North Korea, that is, seal it off to a certain extent from the outside world, is precisely because they're on a volcano.
They've been sitting on that volcano for 43 years, and every month of every year since the revolution, everyone's been saying that volcano is going to blow. And here's the latest evidence of that fact, and it just doesn't blow, because the anecdotal evidence that you're talking about, Mike, is anecdotal, and it's anecdotal, and it gets to the people who have some kind of connection to the type of people who send out such anecdotal evidence and have no connection and no exposure to the greater majority that send out completely antithetical evidence. And I just want to say, guys, you can go anywhere in the world and ask any population of any state, and they will all have the nastiest things to say about their government. And the idea that we can either anecdotally or even via some kind of survey, right? The Iranians themselves do surveys today. It's not as closed a regime as you think. And they do surveys, and they even admit in their government censored papers, they admit the majority of the people think, this particular government's doing an awful job about X, Y, and Z. Everybody complains. Are the Iranian complaints so substantial and so ontological that they're talking about a counter-revolution to change that regime into something that resembles America more? I don't see it anywhere, and I certainly don't see it more in Iran than I see it in many other countries in the world. I just don't think it's a sui generis situation. We just want it to be. And so when we see them, a colleague of mine wrote a book called The Lipstick Counter-Revolution. And her claim was because all these young people are interested in the latest fads and the latest, hauteur and fast cars and fast women, that's it. This is the end of the regime. They've been saying this for decades. But the fact of the matter is that it's politicized youth that might have some chance of changing the regime. But these youth aren't politicized. They're the exact opposite. They go to the mall. That's what they think about. And the Ayatollahs are perfectly happy to let them do it. Because under it all, in the last analysis, they still feel proud of what they've got there. Iran is becoming more powerful all the time on the regional and international scene. And it's not for nothing. You can't get that powerful if you're sitting on all these people who just hate your guts.
Let me ask a question by way of analogy. I think that there is a string of Israeli prime ministers. My purpose in asking this question is not to be partisan in Israeli politics, but I would say by and large and for the most part, it's fair to say that there's a string of prime ministers who, when you say to them, what is the purpose, the end, the goal of this country? It is to reenact the ability for the Jewish people to have a role in history, to have sovereignty over themselves and take responsibility for their national existence in history. So now if I were to come to the leadership of Iran and say, what is this country for? Ze'ev, do you have an answer to that question?
I'll make it really short because I've been blabbing on. It's, just like on one foot, they could easily tell you this country is the vehicle for the exportation of political Islam in the region and in the world. That's what we're here for. We may take all types of detours along the way. We may make lots of mistakes, and we may not even get there, but that is what we're here for, and we never forget it. And again, politicians and even clerics, they have to do practical things and make compromises on their principles all day long in order to get stuff done. A good manager knows that. But in the end, they've got that in their heads. And from what I understand of Ayatollah Khamenei and whoever's going to be his successor, that's the ultimate game plan. And they do not lose sight of it. And we must not lose sight of that.